So today I have a JVC JL-A20 belt drive semi-automatic turntable, and I was able to get this for the price of $0 because the seller said it did not work and is obviously missing a bunch of parts, including head shell and cartridge, the counterweight, the belt, and also feet, hinges, and a lid. So let's see what's going on with this. So first of all, if I turn the platter, I hear some nasty noises, which is not great. So one of these I had before, the platter was actually seized onto it, but that is thankfully not the case. But let's see if the motor is actually running. So to do this, I'm going to plug it in, and I can feel the spindle of the motor turning with my finger, so that is a good start. So I've removed all of the screws from the perimeter here, as well as here in the middle, although this one was actually missing. And now the cover will lift off. So I'm sure some of this is going to need some cleaning, but I'm going to start with taking the motor out by taking out these 3 screws here. So the way this suspension works is there's these 3 little sort of donuts, and when the turntable is right side up, the rubber donuts suspend the motor on these washers here attached to these screws and giving it some vibration absorption. There's 2 more screws on the other side that I need to take out though too to get the motor out. So the motor is out, and I've flipped it over, and now I'm removing these 2 screws here to take this plate off to get better access to the motor to clean it. And there's all kinds of dirt on here, so I'm going to try to brush it away with this upside down so that the pieces of dirt don't fall into the motor. Got most of the chunky bits off, so now I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to take the motor apart by taking out these 4 screws here. Okay, I got those 4 screws out, so I should be able to lift this out now. So I also loosened the grub screw on the pulley here so I could get it off of the shaft, and everything in there was pretty much as dry as a bone. So I give it a good cleanup with Q-tips and isopropyl alcohol, and I'm going to re-lubricate that with the 3-in-1 motor oil and see how that works. So I'm going to reassemble the motor like this. I'm going to lubricate this since this is not accessible once it's put back together, and screw that back in. So I've put the motor back together and it feels really nice and smooth. Put the pulley back on here too, clean that up with scraping with my fingernail with some alcohol. Before taking it off, I'd measured 2 millimeters between the bottom of it and the deck here. So I installed it back at the same place using this grub screw. I'm going to start by screwing the plate back on. I'm glad I took a picture of this before I started, otherwise it'd be a little confusing. I'm going to put the screws back in this hole and in this hole. And reinsert these 3 screws. So I'll flip it back over, and I'm going to put these 2 screws back in here. So giving the spindle and the well here a good cleanup with alcohol and Q-tips. There seems to be a screw missing here, which is unfortunate, but on the underside I also saw why this was falling out and can fix that from below. So there's a little hole right here for a retaining screw, which when threaded in is going to fit into this groove here and keep this from pulling out. Of course, you don't want it to go in so deep that it contacts the surface here. So I'm going to screw in the smallest M3 screw that I have. That's what the thread is, and that'll retain that from falling out. So flipping it back over, I'm going to oil this up. And this is going to fit into this notch on the gear here. Any car mechanic will tell you that the thing they hate working on the most is a car that's already been worked on somebody and worked on badly. So this turntable's obviously been gone over by somebody, and I think there is a problem here. So the shaft here goes down, obviously, but I think it goes down too far, and it's sort of scraping and contacting here and also coming into contact with the gear. I noticed when the platter was on that the plier seemed to be riding too low and scraping too. So I think probably what's going on is that there's supposed to be a ball bearing at the bottom of this well. And that's not unusual, and then these ride on top of it. But of course that ball bearing is long gone. So I'm gonna have to guess to see what size will fit in there. I think you can see this. So it seems like at the bottom of the well there actually seems to be a wear spot where probably there was a ball bearing. So I'm going to guess that the size of it is the equivalent of our 5/32 ball bearing. So I have plenty of these from bicycle work. So give that a try. So that's definitely riding higher, and it feels pretty smooth. So that retention screw went right in on the bottom, and again didn't screw it in too far. But I suspect the reason it was left off is because the person who took this apart didn't figure out that there was supposed to be a ball bearing in there. Probably fell out when they opened it up, and this was riding too low for that screw to go in. So let's give it a shot now. That sounds pretty good. So I haven't spent any money on this turntable yet, but before I do, I want to make sure that the fundamentals are sound. And of course, one of those is spinning the platter at the correct RPM. So I had a belt from another JVC that was similar that I worked on before. So I've installed that. So let's see how it runs. That is a little bit slow, but in the ballpark. And the same is true for 45. So that is actually a good sign. So while the speed was very good, when it was running, I did hear somewhat of a scraping sound. Now, I did not hear that when the platter was just spinning on its own without the belt on, this showing this bearing is in good shape. But the scraping sound was occurring when it was running with the belt on. So looking at the manual helped me to figure out what that was. So the problem was that the belt was scraping on, I believe, the top leg of this black plastic piece. So what that piece does is it simply shunts the belt up and down on this pulley. So the top position is for 33, the bottom position for 45. So when I reinstalled this pulley, I thought I put it in the right position, but actually did not. So what I had to do was move it up so that the belt did not drag on the inside of this. So by holding the screwdriver at an angle, I was able to loosen the screw, move the pulley up, and get the belt centered right on the middle of each part of the pulley and right between the two legs of this piece. So another problem I found was that the tone arm was not moving when the pieces underneath that are supposed to move it were moving. And the reason was because this had slid up on the shaft of the tone arm. And the reason it did that is because the little Allen screw here that tightens it against the shaft is held in place by this piece of plastic, which has cracked. So the more you tighten it, the more it makes that crack worse. So I'm going to try to glue that and see if that will get this to hold. So I spread the crack out a bit on both sides with a toothpick, dripped some liquid super glue in there, and now I have it clamped. So hopefully that will do the trick. So my gluing fix seems to have worked here. So I want to tighten this up very carefully, but the question is where? Because this can move freely on the shaft that the tone arm is on. Actually, the answer seems to be when it's far enough this way that the micro switch over here is depressed to shut off the motor. So we'll put it there. So next on the list is the cueing, because it does not work at all. So here is the switch that operates the cueing. And that works just fine, but it's not connected to anything. So the cueing is actually controlled by this part up here. So you can see the plunger under there with the spring. So as I move this, there's like a ramp on the plastic piece that pushes the plunger up, and then it comes back down. But there's no connection between those two things, and it seems like it should be going through here. So this appears to be the damper that lets the tone arm drop slowly. So this has damping fluid inside of it between some discs, but again, there's no connection here. I removed the damper, and clearly there's a piece under here that is quite broken. So that looks like it's going to be difficult to replace. So this must be a common enough failure point for these turntables that a brand new 3D printed part is available for it and other similar turntables. So here's one, here is another one, but the expense of shipping this from the other side of the world is pretty high. It's too bad you can't just buy the file and print it yourself. That would save a lot of time and money. But also some used parts are available. So here is a lot of parts from that turntable, and here is our little guy right here. So $20 for this group of parts, and I might be able to use some of these other ones too. And the same seller also has a counterweight that will work. So the first time I flipped this turntable over, first of all, the spindle fell out. I fixed that, but also this drive gear fell right off. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing because I wanted to clean it anyway, but I need to put this back on. So I've cleaned the channel here with Q-tips and isopropyl alcohol, so that's nice and clean. I'm going to put some new grease in there. I use Super Lube multi-purpose synthetic grease for this purpose. Okay, I've got that greased up. So when I put it down, first of all, this notch here needs to be up against this gear here for clearance. But the important part really is this part right here. So this part, you can see the tone arm moving a little bit as I move that. So this part needs to be inside the heart-shaped groove here, not on the outside, not on the inside, but in that channel. So when I put this on, I'm going to have to manipulate it a little bit from the bottom to make sure that that fits in. Okay, so the platter is going to spin this way, so the gear actually spins in the opposite direction, and I can feel it is, and you can see the tone arm moving, that is working. So the reason it fell off was that there was no circlip installed here on the top, so it's not the original, but I managed to find an English-sized circlip that seems to fit in this notch just fine. So when you watch the platter spin, you can see there's a bit of a wobble to it. So using the deck here as a reference, you can see there's points where that's higher and points where it's lower. So if we look at the spindle though, and if you block out the platter, the spindle is not bent. The spindle seems to be just fine. So the problem is with the platter itself, and most likely actually with the hole in the middle of the platter. So I've used a ruler to measure where the highest and lowest points of this are as it moves around, and put a little piece of tape on the turntable to indicate that. As you would expect, the highest and lowest points are pretty much directly opposite of each other. So if the hole in the middle of the platter that goes over the spindle was slightly bent, it would change the angle of the platter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a long screwdriver and insert it in the platter, and I'm going to very, very gently try to bend the bottom in this direction toward the high side. That's going to tilt the middle of the platter so the high side will now be lower. I need to do this very, very gently, just a little bit at a time. So it took some trial and error. I had to do it more than once, but now I think there's a lesser variation between the high and the low spots. So I think I'll take this. I don't want to try to go too far with it. And again, if you're going to attempt this, be very, very gentle. So for a cartridge, I'm going to use this Audio-Technica AT3600L mounted in a generic Techniques style cartridge. So you can get a combination like this brand new on eBay for about $25, which is a real steal. So this is a genuine cartridge, but it has a different stylus on it, a generic one that tracks actually at only 2 grams instead of the 3.5 grams that the standard stylus does. So there are differences between a standard Technique style head shell and one that's intended for a JVC. So if I line up the flanges at the back, you'll see that the slots in the JVC extend somewhat further back than they do on the Techniques one. And that's important because the JVC cartridge alignment is not the same as the Techniques one. So this is a Techniques alignment gauge. So normally you line up the tip of the stylus with the end of this, which is at 52 millimeters from the flange here. But for a JVC, that distance is only 49 millimeters. So if I put that in, I've put a piece of tape on here, and that's actually pretty close to lined up there. So I had to jam it all the way back in the head shell here to get that alignment. So depending on the cartridge that you use, that may or may not work. If you can't get it far enough back, it won't align properly. However, JVC have built a neat little alignment gauge into the turntable. So there's this little spot right here. It says overhang. So if I extend this over it, the tip of the stylus should fall into that little window, which it does. So that is handy. So the bag of goodies arrived today. So for the top side, we have the counterweight, and I have a 3rd screw to properly secure the spindle here. So on the bottom side, I now have the correct fixing screw for the turntable spindle here. And this return arm, the one that came in the kit, has a rubber block that's in better condition than the one that was on the turntable. So I'm just going to switch these out. And this was unexpected. The kit also came with a new piece to connect to the tone arm that's not cracked. So to install this, I'm going to have to desolder the wires from the tone arm to get them out of the hole to get this thing off. But having that part is, well, it's too good to be true, and I need to do it. But this is the little one that I really needed. So this piece has this nub here that the other one did not. And the damping on this actually feels pretty good. I think I'm just going to install this as is. And there we go. Look at that. Damping might be working even too well. So let's test the automated function. So if it's playing and I hit the reject lever, it returns very nicely to the rest. Let's stop at the end of the record. No, it will not. So the service manual for this turntable is very helpful and describes what to do to fix this problem. So the directions say to turn this screw here counterclockwise to make the stylus pick up earlier on the end of the record. So what is that going to do? So if I loosen this screw, it's going to move these 2 plastic pieces closer together. And in doing that, it's going to then shove this black piece further to the left. So in doing so, it's going to come in contact with the pin that triggers the mechanism earlier. So let's give that a try. So I did a half a turn and that wasn't quite enough. And then I did about another half a turn. And the arm is slow to drop, but there you go. That looks pretty good. It's right about there in the middle of the dead wax, so I think that would work well with just about any record. And finally, the feet. So normally my go-to replacement feet are these neoprene domes, which work great, but there's a problem. While they fit in the recess, they do not actually extend far enough below the bottom of the turntable to actually work. So instead, I purchased these replacement feet that are a combination of aluminum and absorptive rubber. Strangely, they came with screws, but no nuts. But the holes here are not large enough to accept the screws. I'm going to have to drill them out, which I'm going to do, of course, with the base not attached to the turntable. When I screw the base back on, I need to make sure I get this grounding lug here. And those look pretty fancy. And that's it. So I've probably worked on about 5 JVC turntables so far, and this was like a mid-market model when it was new. But one thing that's impressed me about all of them is that they all seem very well engineered. In particular, they use fewer parts to do the same things, like semi-automatic operation, than an equivalent Sony or dual model. And that makes them also easier to fix. So while this turntable had obviously been badly neglected and badly worked on before, with the right parts and a little bit of fiddling, it's now working perfectly. So from a financial standpoint, was it worth it to part this turntable back in? Absolutely not. Even though I paid nothing for it, I spent far more on parts than it could really be sold for. But the only thing that's more fun than listening to records is listening to records on a turntable that you brought back to life with your own 2 hands. So, thanks for watching.